Princess Zara of the Caltharian Empire had exactly three things on her mind as her luxury diplomatic shuttle descended toward the backwater planet of Nexus 7. First, why did peace treaties always have to be signed on planets that smelled like sulfur and disappointment? Second, could she get through this ceremony without actually having to touch any of the local dignitaries? And third, how soon could she get back to her climate-controlled palace where the servants knew how to prepare her morning beverage without setting anything on fire? What she definitely wasn't thinking about was the possibility that her day was about to go from mildly inconvenient to absolutely catastrophic in the span of about 30 seconds. "Your Highness," Captain Vex announced from the pilot's seat, his voice carrying that special tone that military officers use when they're trying not to panic. "We have a situation." Zara looked up from her personal datapad where she'd been reviewing the 17 different ways she could diplomatically insult today's treaty partners without technically violating interstellar law. "What kind of situation, Captain? The boring kind where you worry about fuel efficiency, or the interesting kind where we all die horribly?" "Well, Your Highness, I'd say it's leaning toward the second option." That's when the ship exploded. Not completely, mind you. The Caltharians built their diplomatic vessels with the same attention to safety that they applied to their tax collection methods, which is to say very thoroughly and with multiple redundancies. But when a Scarif assault missile connects with your starboard engine at precisely the wrong moment, even the best engineering tends to become what experts technically call completely useless. Zara found herself pressed against her crash restraints as the shuttle spun through Nexus 7's atmosphere like a very expensive, very doomed pinwheel. Through the viewport she caught glimpses of rocky terrain rushing up to meet them at speeds that her survival instincts suggested were probably excessive. "Captain Vex," she said, with the kind of calm that only comes from either extensive meditation training or complete psychological shock, "I don't suppose this is part of some elaborate surprise I should be enjoying." "I'm afraid not, Your Highness. It appears someone has decided to interrupt our diplomatic mission with what I can only describe as gratuitous violence." The shuttle hit the ground with all the grace of a falling refrigerator, bounced twice and came to rest in what appeared to be a small crater of its own making. Zara's first thought was that her hair probably looked terrible. Her second thought was that having terrible hair might be the least of her problems. She managed to extract herself from the wreckage with only minor damage to her dignity and several new scratches on her ceremonial armor. Captain Vex emerged from the pilot's section looking like he'd just gone 10 rounds with a particularly aggressive piece of furniture, but he was alive and still capable of walking in approximately straight lines. "Status report, Captain," Zara said, because saying official-sounding things seemed like a good way to pretend she had some control over the situation. "Well, Your Highness, the shuttle is what we might charitably call completely destroyed. Our communications array is down, our emergency beacon is broadcasting to nobody in particular, and according to my readings we're surrounded by approximately 200 heavily armed Scarif warriors who seem very interested in making our acquaintance." "Wonderful. I don't suppose you have any good news to balance that out." "Actually, I do have one piece of potentially positive information. There appears to be a local inhabitant approaching our position, and he doesn't seem to be shooting at us." Zara looked in the direction Captain Vex was pointing and saw a figure walking toward them across the rocky terrain. The figure was humanoid, dressed in what appeared to be military surplus clothing held together with tape and optimism, and carrying a rifle that looked like it had been manufactured sometime during the galaxy's early industrial period. As the figure got closer, Zara realized with a mixture of curiosity and mild horror that she was looking at a human. An actual genuine no-kidding human being. She'd heard about humans, of course. Everyone in the galaxy had heard about humans. They were the species that had somehow managed to join the galactic community despite having technology that barely qualified as functional and a tendency to solve complex problems by hitting them with hammers until something worked. The human reached their position and stopped, looking them over with an expression that suggested he was not particularly impressed by what he saw. "Let me guess," he said, in the flat nasal accent that Zara recognized as typical of Earth's North American continent. "Diplomatic shuttle, ceremonial armor, and that special look that says you've never had to change your own oil. You must be the Caltharian princess everyone's been talking about." Zara drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable, and fixed the human with her most intimidating royal stare. "I am Princess Zara of the Caltharian Empire, and you are?" "Jake Murphy," the human replied, completely unimpressed by her attempt at intimidation. "Most people call me Deadshot, on account of I'm really good at shooting things. And right now, Princess, you and your friend here are about 30 seconds away from becoming very dead, so if you want to continue this conversation somewhere that doesn't involve getting riddled with Scarif pulse rifle fire, I suggest you follow me and try to keep up." Without waiting for a response, Jake turned and started walking toward a cluster of rocks that might charitably be called adequate cover. Zara looked at Captain Vex, who shrugged in the universal gesture of military personnel who had run out of better options. I suppose we're following the human, she said. It would appear so, Your Highness, and that's how Princess Zara of the Keltharian Empire found herself trudging across an alien landscape, following a sarcastic human mercenary who clearly had no appreciation for proper protocol, while being hunted by an army of warriors who wanted to use her as a political bargaining chip. It was definitely not turning out to be the kind of day she'd planned for. Jake led them through a maze of rocky outcroppings that provided just enough cover to keep them from being immediately vaporized by enemy fire. Princess Zara was discovering that scrambling over jagged rocks in ceremonial armor was significantly less dignified than the palace etiquette instructors had prepared her for. So, she said, trying to maintain some semblance of royal composure while climbing over a boulder that seemed specifically designed to snag expensive fabric. I don't suppose this is just a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps they think I'm someone else. Someone significantly less important. Jake glanced back at her with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his decision to help. Princess, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is they definitely know exactly who you are. The bad news is that's precisely why they shot down your shuttle and are currently trying to capture you alive. Capture me alive? Well, that's oddly reassuring. Yeah, don't get too comfortable with that idea. See, the Scarith aren't exactly known for their hospitality. They're planning to use you as leverage against your empire, which means keeping you breathing just long enough to make some very unreasonable demands. Captain Vex, who had been maintaining a stoic silence while bleeding from several minor cuts, finally spoke up. Mr. Murphy, how exactly do you know so much about Scarith tactical doctrine? Jake stopped behind a cluster of rocks that provided decent cover and checked his rifle's ammunition supply. Well, Captain, let's just say I've had some previous professional disagreements with the Scarith. They tend to remember people who cost them money, and I tend to remember people who try to kill me for it. Zara was beginning to suspect that Jake's definition of previous professional disagreements might involve significantly more violence than the term suggested. What kind of professional disagreements? The kind where I got paid to make sure their operations on 3 different worlds came to what you might call abrupt conclusions. Turns out the Scarith take that sort of thing personally. You've fought the Scarith before? Captain Vex asked, with the tone of someone discovering that their random rescuer might actually be competent. Fought them, outsmarted them, occasionally made them look like complete idiots in front of their own troops. It's been a mutually beneficial relationship, if you define beneficial as me getting paid and them getting dead. Princess Zara was starting to reassess her initial impression of the human. And you're confident you can get us out of this situation? Princess, confidence is a luxury I can't afford right now. What I can tell you is that we've got approximately 15 minutes before the Scarith finish surrounding this position, and after that our options become significantly more limited. Limited how? Well, we can surrender and hope they keep you alive long enough to negotiate, or we can try to fight our way out of a situation involving us versus 200 heavily armed warriors who specialize in exactly this kind of combat. Captain Vex winced as he adjusted his position behind cover. Those don't sound like particularly appealing options. They're not, but there's a third option, which is why I'm here in the first place. Jake pulled out a small electronic device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and wishful thinking. I was actually on this planet tracking a Scarith war chief named Krug. Big guy, even by Scarith standards, with a reputation for turning peaceful negotiations into absolute bloodbaths. Let me guess, Zara said. This Krug person is the one responsible for our current predicament. Krug's not just responsible for shooting down your shuttle, Princess. He's the one who's been orchestrating attacks on diplomatic convoys throughout this sector. Your little peace treaty ceremony was supposed to be his biggest score yet. The pieces started clicking together in Zara's mind, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. So this wasn't random violence. This was a planned operation. Very planned. Krug's been studying Keltharian diplomatic protocols for months, learning your security procedures, figuring out exactly how to turn your own peace negotiations against you. Captain Vex looked up from where he was trying to bandage a particularly stubborn wound. Mr. Murphy, if you knew about this threat, why didn't you warn the appropriate authorities? Jake's laugh had about as much humor as a tax audit. Captain, I tried. I sent warnings through every official channel I could find. Know what I got back? Form letters thanking me for my concern and assuring me that proper authorities were handling the situation. The proper authorities being us, Zara said, with the sinking realization that her empire's intelligence services might not be as intelligent as advertised. The proper authorities being a diplomatic convoy with ceremonial weapons and the kind of security protocols that work great for garden parties, but tend to fall apart when people start shooting missiles at you. A series of energy weapon discharges lit up the rocks around their position, followed by the distinctive sound of Scarith war cries getting progressively closer. Speaking of people shooting at us, Jake said, checking his rifle again, we need to move. Now, where exactly are we moving to? Zara asked, trying to sound composed while privately wondering if royal dignity was worth maintaining under these circumstances. There's an old mining facility about 2 miles from here. It's got some defensible positions and a communication array that might still be functional. Might be functional. Princess, at this point might is the best I can offer you. The alternative is definitely getting captured by Krug's forces, and I can guarantee you won't like what comes after that. Captain Vex struggled to his feet, looking determined despite his injuries. Your Highness, I recommend we follow Mr. Murphy's guidance. Our conventional tactics are clearly inadequate for this situation. Zara looked around at their current cover, which was rapidly becoming inadequate as Scarith forces closed in from multiple directions. She thought about her comfortable palace, her predictable diplomatic schedule, and her general policy of avoiding situations that involved people trying to kill her. Then she looked at Jake, who was calmly preparing to lead them through hostile territory against impossible odds, apparently because it was just another day at the office for him. Very well, Mr. Murphy. Lead the way. But I want you to know that if we survive this, I'm going to have some very pointed questions about human military doctrine. Princess, if we survive this, I'll be happy to explain exactly why human military doctrine involves a lot more improvisation and a lot less planning than your people probably consider wise. Jake shouldered his rifle and started moving toward their next piece of cover. But first, let's see if we can get through the next 2 hours without getting killed. Everything else is just details. As they began their desperate trek across hostile terrain, Princess Zara couldn't help but notice that Jake moved with the kind of casual competence that suggested he'd done this sort of thing before. Many times before. She was beginning to suspect that her assumptions about human capabilities might need some serious revision. The trek to the mining facility turned out to be what Jake cheerfully described as a moderate hike through mildly hostile terrain, which Princess Zara was learning was human code for a nightmarish death march through an active war zone. Mr. Murphy, she said, trying to maintain royal composure while sliding down a rocky slope that seemed designed by someone with a personal grudge against expensive footwear. When you said 2 miles, I assumed you meant 2 miles of reasonable terrain, not 2 miles of what appears to be the galaxy's most inconvenient obstacle course. Jake, who was moving through the treacherous landscape with the casual ease of someone taking a leisurely stroll, glanced back at her. Princess, if you wanted reasonable terrain, you probably should have crashed somewhere else. Nexus 7 specializes in the kind of geography that makes you question your life choices. I didn't choose to crash here, no, but you did choose to wear ceremonial armor on a diplomatic mission to a planet known for its hostile wildlife, unpredictable weather, and tendency to host violent conflicts. So your judgment was already questionable before the crashing part. Captain Vex, who was keeping pace despite his injuries through what appeared to be pure military stubbornness, spoke up. Mr. Murphy, in your professional opinion, what are our chances of reaching this facility without encountering enemy forces? Well, Captain, I'd say our chances are somewhere between slim and non-existent, with a slight possibility of catastrophic failure thrown in for variety. That's not particularly encouraging. I'm not in the encouragement business. I'm in the keeping people alive business, and that requires a certain amount of honest communication about how bad things actually are. As if summoned by Jake's words, a Scarith patrol appeared on a ridge about 300 yards away. There were 4 of them, armed with energy weapons and moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. Speaking of how bad things are, Jake said, smoothly transitioning from casual conversation to combat readiness, we've got company. Princess Zara looked up at the patrol and felt her stomach perform what could charitably be described as an unauthorized acrobatic routine. Are they going to shoot at us? Princess, they're Scarith warriors on a combat mission. Shooting at people is basically their entire job description. The first energy blast confirmed Jake's assessment, scorching the rocks about 6 inches from Zara's head and filling the air with the smell of superheated stone. Right, Jake said, with the tone of someone discussing a minor scheduling inconvenience. Change of plans. We're going to take a slight detour through that ravine over there. That ravine looks like it goes in the completely wrong direction, Zara pointed out, while trying to make herself as small a target as possible. It does go in the wrong direction, but it also goes in the not getting shot direction, which I'm prioritizing right now. Jake led them into the ravine at a pace that Zara's royal etiquette training had definitely not prepared her for. Behind them, she could hear the Scarith patrol following, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls in a way that did not inspire confidence. Mr. Murphy, she said, breathing harder than she cared to admit. I don't suppose you have a plan for dealing with our pursuers. I have several plans, Princess. Most of them involve you and the captain staying very quiet while I handle the shooting part. You're going to fight 4 armed warriors by yourself. I'm going to fight 4 overconfident warriors who think they're chasing helpless refugees. There's a difference. Jake stopped at a bend in the ravine and motioned for them to take cover behind a fallen boulder. Stay here, don't move, don't make noise, and definitely don't try to help. What are you going to do? Captain Vex asked. Something that your military training probably didn't cover in the section on proper tactical doctrine. Jake disappeared around the bend with his rifle, leaving Zara and Captain Vex crouched behind their rock trying to figure out what exactly constituted proper hiding technique. What followed was a brief but intense firefight that sounded like someone was having a very heated argument with the laws of physics. There were energy weapon discharges, several explosions, and at least one noise that Zara couldn't identify, but which sounded vaguely like someone hitting a gong with a very large hammer. Then everything went quiet. Jake reappeared a few minutes later, looking entirely too casual for someone who had just engaged in mortal combat. Okay, we're good to go. What happened to the patrol? Zara asked. They're not patrolling anymore. Did you kill them? Princess, that's not really the kind of question you want to ask when someone just saved your life. The appropriate response is thank you, followed by whatever Jake says we should do next. Captain Vex, who had been staring at Jake with a mixture of respect and bewilderment, finally found his voice. Mr. Murphy, how exactly did you neutralize 4 armed opponents by yourself? Trade secrets, Captain. Let's just say that Scarith tactical doctrine works really well when you're fighting people who follow the same tactical doctrine. It works significantly less well when you're fighting people who learn combat strategy from action movies and bar fights. They continued through the ravine, which eventually opened up onto a plateau that offered a clear view of their destination. The mining facility sat in the distance like a collection of industrial buildings that had been abandoned by people with more sense than the current occupants of the plateau. There it is, Jake said. Home sweet heavily fortified home. Princess Zara studied the facility through the scope that Jake had loaned her, trying to assess their chances of actually reaching it alive. It looks abandoned. It is abandoned. That's why it's perfect. Nobody expects refugees to hide in a place that doesn't have room service. I don't require room service, Mr. Murphy. I simply prefer accommodations that don't look like they're about to collapse. Princess, structural integrity is a luxury we can't afford right now. What we can afford is a place with thick walls, defensible positions, and communication equipment that might let us call for help. Captain Vex was scanning the terrain between their position and the facility. Mr. Murphy, I count at least 3 more Scarith patrols between here and our destination. I see them too, Captain. Which brings us to the fun part of today's adventure. The fun part. The part where we get to find out if Keltharian royalty can move fast enough to avoid getting shot when we make our final approach to the facility. Zara looked at the distance they had to cover, then at the enemy forces positioned to intercept them, then at Jake, who seemed to view the entire situation as just another interesting challenge. Mr. Murphy, I'm beginning to suspect that your definition of fun differs significantly from mine. Princess, my definition of fun is staying alive long enough to collect payment for jobs well done. Your definition of fun is probably something involving servants and comfortable furniture. That's not entirely inaccurate. Well, today you get to expand your horizons. Think of it as character building. Jake checked his rifle one more time and started moving toward the facility. Try to keep up, Your Highness. And remember, if anyone starts shooting at us, the appropriate response is to run faster, not to stop and complain about the unfairness of the situation. As they began their final approach, Princess Zara found herself running across hostile terrain, following a human who treated mortal danger like a minor inconvenience, while being pursued by warriors who wanted to use her as a political bargaining chip. And despite everything, she was starting to suspect that Jake Murphy might actually get them out of this alive. The mining facility turned out to be exactly as advertised, a collection of industrial buildings that looked like they'd been designed by engineers who prioritized function over aesthetics, then abandoned by people who discovered that mining on Nexus 7 was significantly more dangerous than the initial surveys had suggested. Jake led them to what had once been the facility's main communications tower, a structure that rose about 60 feet above the surrounding buildings and offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. It also offered a commanding view of the problem they were facing. Well, Jake said, settling behind the scope of his rifle and surveying the landscape below, this is either going to be the most impressive thing I've ever done, or the last thing I ever attempt. Princess Zara followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. Spread across the valley below them was what could only be described as an army. Hundreds of Scarith warriors were positioned in organized formations, with vehicles, heavy weapons, and enough firepower to level a small city. And in the center of it all, surrounded by the evacuation zone where thousands of civilian refugees were gathered, was a figure that even at this distance radiated menace and authority. That would be Krug, Jake said, adjusting his rifle scope with the casual precision of someone who'd done this particular task many times before. Captain Vex, who had managed to patch himself up enough to be functional, stared at the scene below. Mr. Murphy, that's not just a war chief. That's an entire military operation. Yeah, Krug doesn't do anything small. When he decides to take hostages, he takes all the hostages. Princess Zara was running calculations in her head, using the kind of advanced mathematics that came with a royal education in military science. The numbers she was getting back were not encouraging. Mr. Murphy, according to my analysis, Krug is positioned approximately 2.3 miles from our current location. Sounds about right. 2.3 miles is well beyond the effective range of any projectile weapon, especially considering atmospheric conditions, gravitational variance, and the Coriolis effect of planetary rotation. Jake continued making minute adjustments to his rifle scope. Princess, has anyone ever told you that you think too much? Thinking is generally considered a virtue among my people. Mr. Murphy, I'm trying to explain that what you're considering is mathematically impossible. Yeah, I got that part. What you're missing is that impossible is just another word for something nobody's tried hard enough yet. Captain Vex was studying the tactical situation with growing alarm. Mr. Murphy, even if you could somehow make that shot, Krug is surrounded by his personal guard. The likelihood of achieving a clear line of sight is minimal. Captain, you're absolutely right. Under normal circumstances, this would be a completely stupid thing to attempt. And under current circumstances, it's still completely stupid. But it's also the only chance those refugees have. Jake pulled out a small device that looked like a weather monitor crossed with a scientific calculator. See, the thing about impossible shots is that they're only impossible if you try to do them the way everyone expects you to do them. He started taking measurements of wind speed, air pressure, humidity, and about a dozen other atmospheric variables that Princess Zara hadn't even considered. The Scarith are expecting conventional tactics. They're positioned to defend against orbital bombardment, ground assault, maybe some kind of flanking maneuver. They're not expecting one guy with a rifle to try something that violates several laws of physics. That's because violating laws of physics generally results in failure and death, Zara pointed out. Only if you don't account for all the variables, Princess. See, your people are really good at calculating what should happen. Humans are really good at figuring out what actually happens, which are two completely different things. Jake was now making adjustments to his rifle that went far beyond anything Princess Zara had seen in her military training. He was modifying the scope, adjusting the barrel elevation, and making calculations on a piece of paper that looked like someone had tried to solve differential equations while riding a roller coaster. Mr. Murphy, she said, what exactly are you accounting for that our tactical computers missed? Well, for starters, your computers assume that bullets follow predictable trajectories. Human bullets don't follow predictable trajectories. They follow stubborn trajectories, which is completely different. That doesn't make any sense. Princess, has anything about today made sense? Your diplomatic mission got shot down by people who were supposed to be negotiating peace. You're being rescued by a species your people consider technologically primitive. And now you're watching me prepare to make a shot that your mathematics says is impossible. Jake finished his calculations and started loading a very specific type of ammunition into his rifle. The thing is, human mathematics doesn't just account for physics, it accounts for luck, stubbornness, and the general tendency of the universe to behave unpredictably when you need it most. Captain Vex was watching Jake's preparations with fascination and growing concern. Mr. Murphy, what's your actual plan here? My plan is to aim for Krug, account for approximately 17 different environmental factors, adjust for the fact that Nexus 7's gravitational field is slightly irregular, compensate for bullet drop over an extreme distance, and then fire at exactly the right moment. And if I miss, those refugees get used as bargaining chips in a war that could destabilize this entire sector. If I miss, Princess Zara becomes leverage in negotiations that will probably involve the deaths of millions of people. If I miss, Krug continues his campaign of turning diplomatic solutions into military disasters. Jake settled into his shooting position, rifle steady despite the distance and the impossibility of what he was attempting. But I'm not going to miss. How can you be so confident? Zara asked. Because Princess, missing isn't an option. And humans are really good at doing things that aren't supposed to be options. Through his scope, Jake could see Krug clearly now. The Scarith war chief was massive even by his species standards, armored in ceremonial battle gear that marked him as both military leader and spiritual figure to his warriors. He was standing on a raised platform, addressing his troops and the cowering refugees with the kind of speech that typically preceded either surrender demands or mass executions. Range, 2.3 miles, Jake murmured, talking himself through the shot. Wind speed, variable but averaging 8 miles per hour from the northeast. Air pressure, slightly below standard. Planetary rotation, accounted for. Gravitational variance, compensated. Target elevation, 43 feet above my position. He made one final adjustment to his scope. Bullet drop over this distance should be approximately 14 feet, but that's assuming standard atmospheric conditions and predictable ballistics. Should be, Captain Vex asked. Should be, is for people who do things the easy way, Captain. I'm about to do this the hard way, which means accounting for factors that don't show up in any tactical manual. Jake took a deep breath, held it, and found that perfect moment of stillness that every sniper knows. The moment when everything else disappears except the target, the rifle, and the shot that has to be made. This is for everyone who said humans don't belong in the big leagues, he whispered, and pulled the trigger. The rifle fired with a sound like controlled thunder. The bullet left the barrel at roughly 3,000 feet per second, beginning a journey that would take it across more than 2 miles of hostile terrain, through atmospheric conditions that should have made accuracy impossible, toward a target that was surrounded by enemies, and protected by the kind of security that was designed to prevent exactly this type of attack. For approximately 4 seconds, the bullet traveled through space and time, following a trajectory that Princess Zara's computers said was mathematically impossible, while carrying with it the hopes of thousands of refugees, and the reputation of human marksmanship throughout the galaxy. And then, at exactly the moment when physics said the bullet should have fallen harmlessly to the ground, it found its target. Krug, in the middle of what was probably a very inspiring speech about the glorious conquest of inferior species, suddenly developed a small but very decisive hole in his forehead. He stood there for a moment, looking surprised by this unexpected development, then fell backward off his platform with the kind of dramatic finality that tends to end both speeches and military campaigns. The effect on his army was immediate and spectacular. Scarith warriors who had been organized into disciplined formations suddenly found themselves leaderless and confused. Some started shooting at random targets, others began retreating. Most just stood there trying to figure out what had happened to their supposedly invincible leader. Holy shit, Jake said, which Princess Zara was learning was the human expression for situations that exceeded normal expectations. I actually made that shot. You killed Krug, Captain Vex said, staring at the chaos unfolding in the valley below. I killed Krug, with a shot that your princess just finished explaining was mathematically impossible, Jake replied. A note of satisfaction creeping into his voice. Princess Zara was staring at Jake with an expression that suggested her worldview was undergoing rapid and fundamental revision. Mr. Murphy, how did you make that shot? Princess, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Humans don't just solve problems with mathematics. We solve them with mathematics, engineering, luck, stubbornness, and a general refusal to accept that some things can't be done. Below them, the Scarith army was in full retreat, their superstitions about invincible leaders having been thoroughly disproven by practical demonstration. The evacuation zone was secure, the refugees were safe, and Jake Murphy had just accomplished something that would be talked about in military academies for the next 100 years. Although, Jake added, checking his rifle and preparing to leave their position, I probably should mention that I was actually aiming for the guy standing next to Krug. Princess Zara stared at him. You missed your intended target. Princess, at 2.3 miles, hitting anything human-sized is basically a miracle. Hitting the specific human-sized thing you were aiming for is the kind of miracle that requires divine intervention. So you saved thousands of lives and ended a military crisis by accident. I saved thousands of lives, and ended a military crisis through a combination of skill, luck, and the general tendency of the universe to reward people who are too stubborn to quit when they should. Jake shouldered his rifle and started heading toward the tower's exit. Besides, Princess, in my experience, accidental success is still success. And success is what we're going to call today, regardless of what the mathematics said about our chances. As they prepared to leave the facility, Princess Zara found herself looking at Jake Murphy with completely new understanding. This human, this supposedly primitive member of a supposedly inferior species, had just accomplished something that her empire's best tacticians would have considered impossible. And he'd done it by refusing to accept that impossible meant anything more than difficult. The silence that followed Jake's casual admission about missing his intended target stretched on for what felt like several geological epochs. Princess Zara stood there, staring at the human who had just accomplished the impossible by accident, while her brain attempted to process information that seemed to violate several fundamental principles of how the universe was supposed to work. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of calm that generally preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. "You just ended a military crisis, saved thousands of lives, and eliminated one of the most dangerous war criminals in this sector of the galaxy, and you're telling me it was an accident?" Jake was in the process of disassembling his rifle with the methodical efficiency of someone who had performed this task under significantly more stressful circumstances. "Well, Princess, I wouldn't call it a complete accident. I mean, I was definitely trying to shoot somebody. I just wasn't trying to shoot that particular somebody." "Who were you trying to shoot?" Krug's lieutenant, guy standing about 3 feet to the left, looked like he was coordinating the whole hostage situation. "Figured if I took him out, it might cause enough confusion to give the refugees a chance to escape." Captain Vex, who had been silent during this exchange, finally found his voice. "Murphy, are you saying that your tactical assessment was to create a distraction rather than eliminate the primary target?" "Captain, my tactical assessment was that hitting anything at that range would be lucky, so I aimed for the biggest group of important-looking people and hoped for the best. And instead of hitting your intended target, you achieved a direct hit on the primary objective of the entire mission." "Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. Although in my defense, Krug was standing right next to the guy I was actually aiming for, so it's not like I missed by that much." Princess Zara felt something that might have been laughter attempting to escape from her throat, which was concerning because royal training specifically discouraged inappropriate emotional responses during crisis situations. "Mr. Murphy, do you realize what you've done? I've eliminated a major threat to regional stability and saved a bunch of people who were about to become casualties of war. Also, I've probably earned myself a significant bonus payment, assuming my current employers survive long enough to pay me. You've done something that our best military strategists said was impossible. You've accomplished a mission objective that our tactical computers calculated had a success probability of less than 0.001%. Jake finished packing his rifle and looked at her with the kind of expression that suggested he was trying to figure out why she was making such a big deal about this. "Princess, your tactical computers probably assumed I was going to use conventional methods and follow established military doctrine, and you didn't. I used the Jake Murphy method, which involves ignoring conventional wisdom, making up solutions as I go along, and relying on the general tendency of the universe to reward people who are too stubborn to quit." Captain Vex was studying Jake with the fascination of a military professional encountering a completely new form of warfare. "Mr. Murphy, could you explain your methodology in more detail? For my after-action report." "Sure, Captain. Step 1, identify the problem. Step 2, figure out why conventional solutions won't work. Step 3, try something unconventional. Step 4, if that doesn't work, try something even more unconventional. Step 5, repeat until either the problem is solved or you're dead." "That's not a methodology, Mr. Murphy. That's barely even a plan." "Captain, plans are what you make when you have time, resources, and predictable opposition. When you don't have any of those things, you make do with determination, improvisation, and a willingness to try things that other people consider stupid." Princess Zara was beginning to understand that she was witnessing something that her military education had never prepared her for. "Mr. Murphy, how often does this approach actually work?" "Well, Princess, I'm still alive, which suggests it works often enough. Although I should probably mention that I've also had some spectacular failures using this method. Such as the time I tried to infiltrate a Gorlan fortress by disguising myself as a food delivery service. Turned out the Gorlans don't actually eat food, they absorb nutrients through their skin." That was an awkward conversation. Jake started heading toward the communication equipment that had been their original objective. "But the thing about spectacular failures is that they teach you things that conventional training doesn't cover. Like how to improvise when your original plan falls apart, or how to convince people that your completely insane backup plan is actually brilliant." "And is that what happened today? Your completely insane backup plan turned out to be brilliant." "Today I didn't have a backup plan, Princess. I had a desperate attempt to do something useful before we all got killed. The fact that it worked out better than expected is what we professionals call a happy accident." Jake activated the communication array, which immediately began broadcasting their location and status to anyone in the area who might be interested in providing assistance. Within minutes, they were receiving responses from Keltharian rescue vessels, human merchant ships, and what appeared to be at least 3 different news organizations. "Mr. Murphy," came a voice over the communication system, "this is Admiral Thorne of the Keltharian Third Fleet. Are you the individual responsible for neutralizing the Scarith threat?" Jake picked up the communication device with the casual air of someone answering a routine business call. That would be me, Admiral. Jake Murphy, freelance problem solver. I've got Princess Zara and one of her security officers here, both alive and relatively intact. Mr. Murphy, our tactical analysis indicates that you eliminated the target from a range of over 2 miles. Is that assessment correct? That's correct, Admiral. Although I should probably mention that it took me 3 tries to get the scope calibrated properly. There was a pause on the other end of the communication. Mr. Murphy, our records show that you fired only 1 shot. Yeah, that's because the first 2 tries were just me working out the math in my head. I don't actually shoot until I'm pretty sure I'm going to hit something. Princess Zara was listening to this conversation with growing amazement. Jake was discussing his impossible accomplishment like it was routine maintenance, while military officers who specialized in tactics and strategy were trying to figure out how he'd managed to violate the basic laws of physics. Mr. Murphy, Admiral Thorne continued, the Keltharian Empire would be very interested in discussing your tactical methods with our military academies. Admiral, I'm not sure my tactical methods are the kind of thing you want to teach in military academies. They tend to involve a lot of making things up as you go along and hoping for the best. Nevertheless, we would like to debrief you on the specifics of your engagement with the Scarith forces. Jake glanced at Princess Zara, who nodded encouragingly. Sure, Admiral, I can give you a debrief, but I should probably warn you that my methods don't translate well to traditional military doctrine. Why is that, Mr. Murphy? Because traditional military doctrine assumes that soldiers will follow orders, stick to established procedures, and use tactics that have been tested and proven effective. My methods assume that soldiers will ignore orders when they don't make sense, abandon established procedures when they don't work, and try things that other people haven't been stupid enough to attempt. Captain Vex was taking notes during this conversation, apparently for the after-action report that was going to give his superiors some very interesting reading material. Mr. Murphy, would you say that human military doctrine is fundamentally different from Keltharian military doctrine? Captain, I wouldn't say that human military doctrine is fundamentally different from anybody else's military doctrine. I'd say that human military doctrine is fundamentally different from the concept of military doctrine itself. Could you elaborate on that? Sure, most species develop military doctrine based on the idea that warfare is a predictable activity that can be managed through proper planning, adequate resources, and adherence to established principles. Humans develop military doctrine based on the idea that warfare is complete chaos that can only be managed through improvisation, stubborn determination, and a willingness to try things that would make other species question your sanity. Princess Zara was beginning to understand why the galaxy's military establishment had such difficulty categorizing human tactical capabilities. Mr. Murphy, are you saying that humans deliberately choose unpredictable methods? Princess, I'm saying that humans recognize that unpredictability is the only predictable thing about combat. So instead of trying to impose order on chaos, we learn to thrive in chaos. And that's why you were able to make an impossible shot. I was able to make an impossible shot because I didn't spend time worrying about whether it was impossible. I spent time figuring out how to make it work anyway. Jake finished his conversation with Admiral Thorne and turned to face Princess Zara and Captain Vex. So, Your Highness, what did we learn today? Princess Zara thought about everything that had happened since her diplomatic shuttle had been shot down. She thought about her assumptions about human capabilities, her understanding of military doctrine, and her general worldview regarding the relationship between advanced civilizations and supposedly primitive species. We learned that mathematics isn't always the best way to solve problems, she said finally. And we learned that sometimes the most effective approach is the one that nobody expects. And we learned that humans are significantly more dangerous than our intelligence reports suggested. Jake grinned, which was the first completely unrestricted smile Princess Zara had seen from him all day. Princess, that's probably the most important lesson of all, because if you learn that, then maybe other people will learn it too. And maybe next time, they'll think twice before assuming that humans are just lucky primitives who don't understand how the universe actually works. Is that what you think we assumed? Princess, that's exactly what you assumed. And to be fair, you weren't entirely wrong. We are primitive, and we don't understand how the universe actually works. But we're really good at making things work anyway. As rescue ships appeared on the horizon and the immediate crisis began to resolve itself, Princess Zara found herself looking at Jake Murphy with a completely new understanding of what humans were capable of accomplishing when they decided that impossible was just another word for challenging. 3 weeks later, Princess Zara stood in the Grand Council chamber of the Keltharian Empire, facing a semicircle of the most powerful military and political leaders in her civilization. The formal debriefing had been scheduled to last 2 hours. It was now approaching its 7th hour, and the questions showed no signs of stopping. "Your Highness," said General Kethvar, the Empire's chief military strategist, "I want to make sure I understand your report correctly. You're stating that a single human operative, using primitive projectile weapons, eliminated a target at a distance that our own tactical computers classified as impossible." "That is correct, General. And this human accomplished this feat without advanced targeting systems, orbital support, or any of the technological advantages that our military doctrine considers essential for long-range precision strikes." "Also correct. Using a weapon that fires solid projectiles propelled by chemical explosives." Princess Zara was discovering that repetition did not make the facts any less remarkable, or any easier for her military leaders to accept. "General, I watched him do it. I calculated the mathematical impossibility of the shot myself. And then I watched him make it anyway." Fleet Admiral Zara, who commanded the Empire's strategic forces, leaned forward in her chair. "Your Highness, setting aside the technical aspects of this engagement, I'm more concerned about the tactical implications. Are you suggesting that human military doctrine is fundamentally different from established galactic standards?" "Admiral, I'm suggesting that the term military doctrine may not actually apply to how humans approach combat situations. Could you elaborate on that assessment?" Princess Zara thought back to her conversations with Jake Murphy, trying to find a way to explain concepts that still seemed to violate basic logic. Humans appear to treat established tactical principles as suggestions rather than requirements. They modify their approach based on circumstances that change moment by moment, rather than following predetermined strategies. "That sounds like a recipe for chaos and failure," observed Commander Zenthok, who oversaw the Empire's Special Operations Division. "Commander, that's exactly what I thought. But what I observed was a human who thrived in chaotic conditions specifically because he didn't try to impose order on the situation. Instead, he adapted to the chaos and used it to his advantage." General Kethvar was studying the technical specifications that Captain Vex had provided in his supplementary report. "Your Highness, according to these measurements, the human's weapon had an effective range of approximately 800 meters under optimal conditions. The actual shot was made at a distance of over 3,700 meters. "Yes, General." Jake Murphy fired his weapon at nearly 5 times its maximum effective range, and achieved a precision hit on a target that was partially concealed and moving unpredictably. "That's not tactically sound. That's miraculous." General Jake Murphy told me that humans don't distinguish between tactically sound and miraculous. They just distinguish between what works and what doesn't work. Fleet Admiral Zara was clearly struggling with concepts that didn't fit into her understanding of military science. "Your Highness, how do we incorporate this information into our own tactical doctrine? How do we train our officers to ignore mathematical limitations and attempt impossible tasks?" Princess Zara had been dreading this question, because she suspected that the answer was going to disappoint a lot of very important people. "Admiral, I don't think we can incorporate human tactical methods into our doctrine." "Why not?" "Because human tactical methods aren't based on doctrine. They're based on individual creativity, situational adaptation, and a cultural willingness to attempt things that other species consider suicidal." She paused, thinking about Jake's casual explanation of his methodology. "You can't train someone to ignore mathematical limitations, Admiral. You can only find people who are already inclined to ignore mathematical limitations and then give them weapons." Commander Zenthok looked up from his notes. "Your Highness, are you recommending that we recruit human operatives into our special forces?" "Commander, I'm recommending that we revise our entire assessment of human military capabilities. And I'm suggesting that we consider the possibility that humans might be the most dangerous species in the galaxy precisely because they don't understand why they should be afraid of superior numbers, advanced technology, or mathematical impossibility." The council chamber fell silent as the implications of this assessment sank in. Princess Zara could see her military leaders trying to process the idea that their assumptions about a primitive species might need fundamental revision. General Kethvar finally broke the silence. "Your Highness, what is your personal recommendation regarding future interactions with human military forces?" Princess Zara thought about Jake Murphy, about his casual competence in impossible situations, about his willingness to attempt things that sensible people wouldn't consider. She thought about the way he'd treated her rescue as just another job, and the way he'd accomplished the impossible while complaining about the inconvenience. "General, my recommendation is that we treat humans as allies whenever possible, and that we never under any circumstances underestimate what they're capable of accomplishing when they decide something needs to be done. And if they decide that something we value needs to be undone, then we should probably hope that we can convince them to try something else instead." The formal debriefing concluded with a series of recommendations that would reshape the Empire's intelligence assessments, military planning and diplomatic protocols regarding humanity. Princess Zara left the council chamber knowing that she had just changed how her civilization viewed an entire species. But she also left knowing that Jake Murphy probably wouldn't care about any of that. 2 days later she received a message through diplomatic channels. The transmission was brief, informal, and completely lacking in proper protocol. Princess Mishard, you caused quite a stir with your report. Hope your military people learned something useful. By the way, got another job offer that might interest you. Turns out the Vegan Trade Consortium has been having some problems with piracy in the outer systems. They're looking for someone with experience in unconventional problem solving. Figured I'd ask if you wanted to see how humans handle space pirates. Payment's good, and I promise the accommodations will be better than that mining facility. Let me know if you're interested in expanding your education about human tactical doctrine. Jake. Princess Zara stared at the message for a long time, considering the implications. She had royal duties, diplomatic responsibilities, and a schedule that was planned months in advance. She had absolutely no business running off on mercenary adventures with a human who treated galactic politics like an interesting hobby. On the other hand, she had learned more about practical military science in 1 day with Jake Murphy than she had in 3 years of formal tactical training. And she was beginning to suspect that there were a lot of other things about the galaxy that she didn't understand nearly as well as she thought she did. She composed her reply, Mr. Murphy, I would be very interested in observing your approach to the piracy problem. When do we leave? Princess Zara. His response arrived within hours. Tomorrow if you can manage it. Fair warning though. This job's going to involve actual space travel, possible combat situations, and definitely no room service. Also, you might want to leave the ceremonial armor at home this time. Where we're going, practical beats pretty every time. See you at Docking Bay 7. Jake. Princess Zara looked around her comfortable palace, with its predictable routines, formal protocols, and complete absence of people trying to kill her. Then she looked at Jake's message, with its promise of chaos, uncertainty, and educational experiences that definitely weren't covered in royal curriculum. She started packing practical clothes. Because she was beginning to understand that the most important lessons about the galaxy weren't taught in palaces or council chambers. They were taught by humans who refused to accept that some things couldn't be done, and who were willing to prove it by doing them anyway. And besides, she was curious to see how Jake Murphy planned to handle space pirates. Given his track record, it was probably going to involve something that violated several laws of physics and at least one principle of common sense. Which she was learning, was exactly the kind of solution that worked when conventional wisdom failed. 3 months later, Princess Zara would find herself crouched behind an asteroid, watching Jake Murphy negotiate with pirate captains by challenging them to a game that he'd apparently invented on the spot, and which involved equal parts strategy, luck, and creative interpretation of basic mathematics. But that's another story entirely. The important thing was that Princess Zara had learned the most valuable lesson that anyone could learn about humans. They were the species that looked at impossible situations and asked not how do we avoid this, but how do we make this work for us instead. And in a galaxy full of species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of avoiding impossible situations, that made humans the most dangerous allies and the most unpredictable enemies that anyone could imagine. Which was exactly why Princess Zara had decided that her education about human capabilities was far from complete. After all, if you're going to learn about a species that specializes in accomplishing the impossible, you might as well learn from the best.